David Martinez sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair of the emergency room, his hands shaking as he held his 7-year-old daughter Emma's small hand. The bright fluorescent lights above seemed to mock his despair as he watched the doctors and nurses rushing around. Emma had been running a fever for 3 days, and when she started having trouble breathing that evening, David knew he had to bring her to the hospital immediately. The single father worked 2 jobs to make ends meet, delivering packages during the day and cleaning offices at night. His ex-wife had left them 2 years ago, claiming she couldn't handle the responsibility of being a mother. Since then, it had been just David and Emma against the world. Every penny he earned went toward rent, food, and Emma's needs. He had no health insurance, and the mounting medical bills from previous visits were already crushing him. As Emma lay on the hospital bed, her breathing labored and her face pale, David felt more helpless than he had ever felt in his life. The doctors had run several tests, and each one seemed to cost more money than he could possibly afford. He had already maxed out his credit cards and borrowed money from every friend he could think of. The hospital staff kept asking about insurance, about payment methods, and each question felt like a knife twisting in his heart. "Mr. Martinez?" A young doctor approached him with a clipboard. "We need to run a few more tests on Emma. Her condition is serious and we want to make sure we're not missing anything." David nodded, trying to keep his composure. "Doctor, I need to know how much this is going to cost. I'm barely keeping my head above water as it is." The doctor's expression softened, with sympathy. "I understand your concern, but right now, let's focus on getting Emma better. The billing department can work with you on payment arrangements." Payment arrangements. David had heard those words before. They meant more debt, more sleepless nights wondering how he would pay for groceries and rent, while also handling medical bills. He watched as they wheeled Emma away for another test, and that's when the tears finally came. Sitting alone in that sterile waiting room, David broke down completely. He thought about Emma's mother, Sarah, who had walked out on them without looking back. She had said that being a parent was too hard, that she needed to find herself. David had tried to be both mother and father to Emma, reading her bedtime stories with different voices, braiding her hair for school, and teaching her to ride a bike in their small apartment's parking lot. Emma never complained about not having the things other kids had, the latest toys, fancy clothes, or family vacations. She was grateful for everything, which made David's guilt even worse. The waiting room was filled with other families dealing with their own medical emergencies. David noticed a well-dressed elderly woman sitting across from him. She had silver hair perfectly styled and wore elegant clothes that probably cost more than David made in a month. She seemed out of place in the chaotic emergency room, but she wasn't there as a patient. Instead, she appeared to be observing the people around her, her kind eyes taking in everything. David wiped his tears with the back of his hand, embarrassed that a stranger might have witnessed his breakdown. He tried to compose himself, but the weight of his situation felt overwhelming. Emma was everything to him, and the thought of not being able to afford the care she needed terrified him more than anything else in the world. Hours passed slowly. David called his boss at the delivery company to explain why he wouldn't be at work the next day. Knowing that missing work meant losing money he desperately needed. He also called his night job supervisor, hoping they would understand. Both employers were sympathetic, but David knew that sympathy didn't pay bills. When Emma was finally brought back to the room, she looked even smaller than before. The IV in her arm made her seem so fragile, so vulnerable. David sat beside her bed, holding her hand and whispering words of encouragement. Emma opened her eyes and smiled weakly at her father. "Daddy, are you okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David's heart broke a little more. Even in her sick state, Emma was worried about him. "I'm fine, sweetheart. You just focus on getting better." "I heard you crying," Emma said softly. "Are we in trouble?" David forced a smile. "No, baby. Daddy just got a little scared when you were sick, but the doctors are taking good care of you." Emma nodded, accepting his explanation with the trust that only a child could have. As she drifted back to sleep, David sat there feeling the weight of his failures as a provider. He had always promised Emma that he would take care of her, that she would never want for anything important. But sitting in that hospital room, facing bills he couldn't pay for treatment, his daughter desperately needed, he felt like he was failing her in the most fundamental way possible. The elderly woman he had noticed earlier walked past their room. She paused at the doorway and glanced in, her eyes meeting David's for just a moment. There was something in her expression, not pity, but understanding. She nodded slightly and continued walking, but David couldn't shake the feeling that their brief encounter meant something more than a random glance between strangers. As the night wore on, David's exhaustion began to show. He hadn't slept properly in days, and the stress of the situation was taking its toll. But he refused to leave Emma's side, even when the nurses suggested he try to get some rest. This was his daughter, his responsibility, and he wouldn't abandon her the way her mother had abandoned them both. The hospital around them never slept. Nurses moved quietly through the halls, checking on patients and updating charts. Other families came and went, dealing with their own crises and emergencies. But David felt isolated in his struggle, wondering how other single parents managed situations like this. He thought about all the times he had heard people complain about their problems that seemed insignificant compared to watching your child suffer while being unable to afford proper care. Little did David know that his life was about to change in ways he never could have imagined, and that the elegantly dressed woman who had briefly looked into their room would soon become the catalyst for a transformation that would alter everything he thought he knew about kindness, generosity, and the unexpected ways that hope can appear in our darkest moments. The next morning brought no relief to David's situation. Emma's condition had stabilized, but she wasn't out of danger yet. The doctors wanted to keep her for observation and run additional tests to determine the exact cause of her respiratory problems. Each hour that passed meant more medical expenses piling up, and David felt like he was drowning in debt before it even arrived. Dr. Peterson, the attending physician, sat down with David to discuss Emma's treatment plan. Your daughter has developed pneumonia, and there are signs of complications that we need to monitor closely. She'll need to stay here for at least another 3 to 4 days, possibly longer depending on how she responds to treatment. David's stomach dropped. 3 to 4 days in the hospital would mean thousands of dollars in bills. He ran his hand through his unwashed hair and tried to process the information. Doctor, I have to ask again about the costs. I'm a single father, working 2 minimum wage jobs. I don't have insurance, and I'm already behind on bills from Emma's last visit here 6 months ago. Dr. Peterson looked uncomfortable, the way medical professionals often did when forced to confront the harsh realities of healthcare costs. Mr. Martinez, I understand your situation is difficult. The hospital has some programs for patients who qualify for financial assistance. I'd recommend speaking with our social worker, Mrs. Chen. She might be able to help you navigate some options. Financial assistance programs. David had tried those before. The paperwork was endless, the requirements strict, and even when he qualified for partial help, it still left him with bills he couldn't afford. But he nodded anyway, knowing he had to explore every possible avenue. Thank you, doctor. I'll do whatever I need to do for Emma. After Dr. Peterson left, David walked to the hospital's billing office. The hallways seemed longer than they had the night before, and every step felt heavy with dread. The billing department was exactly what he expected: fluorescent lights, worn carpet, and the perpetual sound of keyboards clicking and phones ringing. Mrs. Rodriguez, the billing coordinator, looked up from her computer screen with practiced efficiency. How can I help you today, Mr. Martinez? David explained his situation, and Mrs. Rodriguez pulled up Emma's account on her computer. Her expression remained neutral as she scrolled through the charges that had already accumulated. I see you have some outstanding balances from previous visits. The current charges for this admission are already at $8,000, and that's just for the first night. $8,000. The number hit David like a physical blow. That was more than he made in 4 months. Is there any kind of payment plan or assistance program I might qualify for? Mrs. Rodriguez handed him a thick packet of forms. You can apply for our charity care program, but I have to tell you that the approval process takes several weeks, and there's no guarantee. You'd need to provide extensive documentation of your income, assets, and expenses. David took the forms, knowing he would fill out every line perfectly even though the chances of getting enough help were slim. As he walked back toward Emma's room, he passed the hospital chapel. He wasn't particularly religious, but desperation had a way of making people reconsider their relationship with faith. He stepped inside the small, quiet space and sat in one of the wooden pews. The chapel was simple but peaceful. A few other people sat quietly, some praying, others just seeking a moment of calm in the chaos of medical emergencies. David closed his eyes and tried to find some inner strength. He thought about Emma's smile, about the way she hummed while coloring, about how she always said thank you for even the smallest things. She deserved so much better than a father who couldn't afford to keep her healthy. When David returned to Emma's room, he found the elegant elderly woman from the waiting room sitting in the chair beside Emma's bed. She was reading a children's book aloud, and Emma was listening with rapt attention despite her illness. David paused in the doorway, unsure whether to interrupt. The woman noticed him and smiled warmly. "You must be Emma's father. I'm Margaret Whitfield. I hope you don't mind. I was walking by and heard Emma asking a nurse about storybooks. I happen to have this one in my bag." David stepped into the room, still cautious, but touched by the stranger's kindness. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Whitfield. I'm David Martinez." Margaret closed the book gently and turned her attention to David. She was probably in her late 60s, with intelligent blue eyes and a presence that commanded respect without being intimidating. "Emma is a delightful child. She's been telling me about her drawings and how you help her with her homework every night after work." Emma perked up despite her fatigue. "Daddy, Mrs. Whitfield has lots of books at her house. She said she used to read to her own children when they were little." Margaret's expression grew softer at the mention of her children. "I did indeed. Those were some of my favorite times." She looked back at David, and he sensed there was more to her story. "Mr. Martinez, might I have a word with you in private?" David glanced at Emma, who had started to doze again, and nodded. They stepped into the hallway, and Margaret's demeanor became more serious but no less kind. "I couldn't help but notice that you seemed distressed last night. I've been coming to this hospital regularly for the past 2 years, and I've learned to recognize the signs of families in crisis." David felt his defenses rising. He didn't want charity, especially not from a stranger, no matter how well-intentioned. "Mrs. Whitfield, I appreciate your kindness to Emma, but we're managing fine." Margaret smiled knowingly. "Mr. Martinez, I wasn't born wealthy. I know what pride looks like because I wore it like armor for many years. But I also know what desperation looks like, and I see both in you right now." Her directness caught David off guard. Most people danced around difficult topics, but Margaret addressed them head-on. "I don't know what you're suggesting, Mrs. Whitfield. I'm not suggesting anything yet, I'm simply observing. You're a good father. That much is obvious from the way Emma talks about you and the way you've been caring for her. But you're drowning, aren't you? The medical bills, the missed work, the constant worry about money while your child is sick." David's carefully constructed composure began to crack. "How could you possibly understand what this is like?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Because 30 years ago I sat in a hospital room very similar to this one, watching my youngest son fight for his life, while my husband and I worried about how we would pay for his care. We had just started our business, and we were barely scraping by. I remember the feeling of being completely helpless, of loving someone so much that you'd give anything to make them well, but not having anything to give." David looked at her with new eyes. This woman, with her expensive clothes and confident bearing, had once been where he was now. "What happened to your son?" "He recovered completely, but the experience taught me something important about the difference between charity and compassion. Charity comes from a sense of obligation or guilt. Compassion comes from recognizing yourself in someone else's struggle." David wasn't sure what to say. Margaret continued, "I've been coming to this hospital because my husband passed away 2 years ago. He died in the cancer ward upstairs. Since then, I've been trying to figure out what to do with the life and resources I have left. Watching families like yours struggle with the same fears we once had, it's given me some clarity about what really matters. The conversation was interrupted by a nurse who needed to check on Emma. As they walked back into the room, David found himself seeing Margaret differently. She wasn't just a wealthy stranger offering pity. She was someone who understood his situation from personal experience. But that knowledge also made him more cautious. If she had overcome financial struggles and built wealth, what did she want from him? Over the next 2 days, Margaret Whitfield became a regular presence in Emma's room. She would arrive each morning with fresh flowers, children's books, or small puzzles that kept Emma entertained during the long hours of treatment. David found himself looking forward to her visits not just because Emma brightened whenever Margaret appeared, but because Margaret treated him with a respect and dignity that he rarely experienced anymore. Margaret never asked intrusive questions about David's finances, but she seemed to understand the weight he was carrying. She would engage Emma in conversations about school, her favorite subjects, and her dreams for the future, while David handled the endless stream of medical consultations, insurance calls, and billing discussions. Sometimes Margaret would simply sit quietly while David made his phone calls, providing a calming presence that somehow made the difficult conversations more bearable. On the third morning, Dr. Peterson brought encouraging news. Emma's pneumonia was responding well to treatment, and her breathing had improved significantly. However, she would need to stay 1 more day for observation, and she would require follow-up visits and potentially ongoing medication for several weeks. After the doctor left, David excused himself to call his employers. The delivery company had been understanding about his absence, but they couldn't hold his position indefinitely. The cleaning company had already hired someone else to cover his route. David stood in the hospital corridor, phone pressed to his ear, trying to negotiate keeping at least one of his jobs while also being available for Emma's medical needs. When he returned to Emma's room, he found Margaret sitting beside the bed. But this time she wasn't reading or talking. She was simply watching Emma sleep, her expression thoughtful and sad. David settled into the other chair, and they sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes. "She reminds me of my daughter at that age," Margaret said softly. "The same curiosity about everything, the same resilience when facing difficulties." David had learned that Margaret had 3 children, all now adults with families of their own. Her husband Richard had built a successful technology company from nothing, and they had created a life of comfort and security for their family. But Margaret rarely talked about her current wealth, focusing instead on the struggles and joys of raising children. "Can I ask you something, Mrs. Whitfield?" David said quietly. "Of course." "Why do you keep coming here? I mean, I'm grateful for your kindness to Emma, but you don't even know us. You could be anywhere else doing anything else." Margaret considered his question carefully. "After Richard died, I found myself with more money than I could possibly spend in my lifetime, but no clear purpose for my remaining years. Our children are successful and independent. I could travel the world, buy expensive things, live in luxury, but none of that felt meaningful." She paused, watching Emma's steady breathing. "Richard and I always talked about the responsibility that comes with financial success. We believed that those who have been fortunate have an obligation to help others. But we were always so busy building the business and raising our children that we never really acted on that belief in a significant way." David listened intently as Margaret continued. "When Richard was diagnosed with cancer, we spent months in hospitals like this one. We were fortunate that money wasn't a concern, but I watched other families struggling with the same medical crises, while also facing financial ruin. It stayed with me." "So you come here to help families like mine?" Margaret shook her head. "I come here to remember what matters. The families I meet remind me that love, courage, and sacrifice are more valuable than anything money can buy. But watching good parents like you suffer because they can't afford medical care for their children, that's a problem money can solve." David felt uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Mrs. Whitfield, if you're thinking about offering us charity, I have to tell you that I can't accept that. I need to take care of my daughter myself." "What if I told you it wasn't charity?" Margaret asked. David looked at her suspiciously. What do you mean? Margaret stood up and walked to the window overlooking the hospital parking lot. Mr. Martinez, in my observations over the past few days, I've seen something remarkable. Despite everything you're facing, financial stress, exhaustion, fear for your daughter's health, you never stop putting Emma first. You speak to her with patience and kindness. You advocate for her medical needs even when the bills terrify you. You work multiple jobs to provide for her, and you never make her feel like she's a burden. She turned back to face David. Those are exactly the qualities I've been looking for. I don't understand. Margaret sat back down and leaned forward slightly. Mr. Martinez, I'm 72 years old. I have significant business interests that require management, charitable foundations that need oversight, and various investments that need attention. But more importantly, I'm lonely. My children live across the country and I see them only a few times a year. My closest friends are also dealing with the losses that come with age. David still wasn't following her logic. Margaret continued, What I'm about to propose isn't charity, Mr. Martinez. It's a job offer. Emma stirred in her sleep, and both adults automatically lowered their voices. Margaret continued speaking quietly but with increasing intensity. I need someone I can trust to help manage my personal affairs. Someone with integrity, strong work ethic, and good judgment. The position would involve coordinating my schedule, overseeing maintenance of my properties, liaising with lawyers and accountants, and essentially serving as my personal assistant and property manager. David stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. Mrs. Whitfield, I appreciate the thought, but I don't have any experience in those kinds of responsibilities. Experience can be learned. Character cannot. You've shown me more about your character in 3 days than most people reveal in years. Margaret's eyes were earnest and determined. The position would come with a substantial salary, full health insurance for both you and Emma, and housing in the guest cottage on my property. Emma would be in an excellent school district, and you'd have the flexibility to be present for her needs while still fulfilling your professional responsibilities. David's mind was reeling. It sounded too good to be true, which in his experience usually meant it was. Why would you offer this to me? You barely know me. I know enough. I know that you've been sitting in this hospital for 3 days without leaving your daughter's side. I know that you've been polite and grateful to every doctor, nurse, and staff member despite your own stress. I know that Emma feels completely secure in your love, which tells me everything about what kind of father you are. Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. I'm not asking for an answer right now. Emma needs to recover and you need time to think. But I want you to consider this opportunity not as charity, but as a chance for both of us to improve our situations. David took the card, his hands trembling slightly. Margaret Whitfield, it read, with an address in one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods. I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it, that's all I ask. Margaret stood up and gathered her purse. I'll be back tomorrow to see how Emma is doing. In the meantime, I'm going to make a phone call to the billing department. Consider it in advance on your potential salary, if you decide to accept my offer. Before David could protest, Margaret had walked out of the room, leaving him alone with Emma and a business card that might represent the answer to all of his problems. Or a situation too complicated for him to handle. That evening, David sat beside Emma's bed, turning Margaret's business card over in his hands. Emma was sleeping peacefully for the first time since they'd arrived at the hospital, her color finally returning to normal. The antibiotics were working, and Dr. Peterson had indicated that they could likely go home the next day if her improvement continued. But going home meant facing the mountain of medical bills that would follow. David had filled out the charity care application, but even if it was approved, it would only cover a portion of the costs. He would be paying off this hospital stay for years, assuming he could even manage the minimum payments. Around 9 o'clock, his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but David answered anyway, hoping it might be related to Emma's care. Mr. Martinez. This is Janet Chen from the hospital's social services department. I wanted to speak with you about your daughter's account. David's heart sank. He prepared himself for another conversation about payment options and financial hardship forms. Yes, Mrs. Chen, I submitted the charity care application this morning. Actually, Mr. Martinez, I'm calling because there's been an unusual development. A benefactor has contacted our billing department about your account. They've offered to cover all of Emma's medical expenses related to this admission, as well as any outstanding balances from previous visits. David was stunned. I don't understand. Who would do that? The benefactor has requested to remain anonymous, but they've asked me to tell you that this is being done without any conditions or expectations. The payment is being processed as we speak. David's mind immediately went to Margaret, but he couldn't bring himself to believe that someone he'd known for only 3 days would make such an enormous gesture. Mrs. Chen, I need to know who this person is. I can't accept this kind of help without understanding what they expect in return. Mr. Martinez, I understand your concern, but I can only tell you what I've been authorized to share. The benefactor specifically requested that you understand this is a gift, not a loan. There are no strings attached, no repayment expected. After hanging up, David sat in the darkened hospital room trying to process what had happened. The financial pressure that had been crushing him for days had suddenly vanished, but the emotional weight of accepting such generosity felt almost as heavy. He had always prided himself on being self-sufficient, on taking care of his own problems. This level of help felt like admitting defeat. Emma woke up around midnight more alert than she had been in days. Daddy, how come you look sad? Are the doctors saying bad things about me? David forced a smile and took her hand. No, sweetheart. The doctors are very happy with how you're doing. You're going to be just fine. Then why do you look worried? David marveled at Emma's perceptiveness. Even at 7 years old, she could read his moods better than most adults. Daddy's just thinking about some grown-up stuff, nothing for you to worry about. Emma studied his face seriously. Is it about money? I heard you talking to the bill people. David's heart broke a little. No child should have to worry about money, but Emma had grown up aware of their financial struggles despite his efforts to shield her from them. Emma, you don't need to think about money, that's my job. Mrs. Margaret is really nice, Emma said, seemingly changing the subject. She told me that sometimes when people have good things happen to them, they like to share good things with other people. She said that's how kindness works. David looked at his daughter with amazement. Somehow Emma had understood something about Margaret's motivations that he had missed. What else did Mrs. Margaret tell you? She said that her little boy was sick in a hospital once just like me, and she said that other people helped her family when they needed help. Now she likes to help other families. David realized that Margaret had been preparing Emma for this moment, helping her understand that accepting help wasn't shameful, but part of a larger cycle of kindness. Emma, how would you feel if we had some big changes in our life? What kind of changes? David wasn't sure how to explain Margaret's job offer to a 7-year-old. Well, what if we moved to a new place? A nicer place with a better school? Emma's eyes lit up with interest. Would it be far away? Not too far. And what if Daddy had a new job that meant he could spend more time with you instead of working 2 different jobs? That would be good, Emma said without hesitation. I miss you when you're working at night. David felt a surge of guilt. He had known that Emma was lonely when he worked his cleaning job, but hearing her say it directly made him realize how much his work schedule had been affecting her. Would you be okay with meeting new people and trying new things? As long as you're with me, Emma said simply. The next morning, Margaret arrived earlier than usual, carrying a small suitcase instead of her usual purse. She looked nervous, which was the first time David had seen any uncertainty in her demeanor. Good morning, she said, settling into her usual chair. I hope you don't mind, but I spoke with Dr. Peterson this morning. He said Emma should be able to go home today. Mrs. Whitfield, David began, but she held up her hand to stop him. Before you say anything, I want you to know that I've taken care of Emma's medical bills. Please don't argue with me about it. Consider it an investment in a potential employee. David had suspected as much, but hearing her confirm it still overwhelmed him. I don't know how to thank you. You can thank me by seriously considering my offer. I brought some information about the position, the property, and Emma's potential school. She handed him a folder from her suitcase. I want you to have all the facts before you make a decision. David opened the folder and was amazed by what he saw. The salary she was offering was more than he currently made from both of his jobs combined. The guest cottage was a fully furnished 2-bedroom home with a yard and garden. The school district was one of the best in the state. The health insurance package was comprehensive and included dental and vision coverage. Mrs. Whitfield, this is incredibly generous, but I have to ask, what happens if this arrangement doesn't work out? What if you decide I'm not right for the job, or what if I can't handle the responsibilities? Margaret appreciated his practical concerns. That's a fair question. If either of us decides the arrangement isn't working, I would provide you with 3 months' notice and assistance in finding new employment. The cottage would be available to you during that transition period. David looked at Emma, who was coloring in a book that Margaret had brought. His daughter looked healthy and happy for the first time in days. The opportunity Margaret was offering could provide Emma with stability, educational opportunities, and medical security that David could never give her on his own. Can I have a few days to think about it? David asked. Margaret smiled. Of course. But David, I want you to understand something. This offer isn't coming from pity or guilt. It's coming from recognition of your worth as a person and as a father. You deserve better than what life has given you so far, and Emma deserves every opportunity to thrive. As Margaret prepared to leave, Emma called out to her, Mrs. Margaret, are you going to be our friend forever? Margaret's eyes filled with tears. If you and your daddy will have me, Emma, I would be honored to be your friend for as long as you want. Later that day, as David packed up their few belongings to leave the hospital, he realized that his life had reached a crossroads. The decision he made about Margaret's offer would determine not just his and Emma's immediate future, but the entire trajectory of their lives. For the first time in years, he had hope that things could be different, better. But accepting that hope meant letting go of his pride and trusting in the kindness of someone who had every reason to help them, but no obligation to do so. David spent the weekend at their small apartment, surrounded by the familiar sounds of thin walls and busy neighbors, trying to make the most important decision of his life. Emma had recovered quickly from her illness and was back to her usual, energetic self. But David couldn't stop thinking about Margaret's offer and what it would mean for both of them. On Saturday morning, David decided to drive to Margaret's address just to see the neighborhood and get a better sense of what they would be walking into. The address led him to an exclusive area he had only seen from the highway, where large homes sat on perfectly manicured lots behind iron gates and stone walls. Margaret's property was impressive, but not ostentatious. The main house was a beautiful, colonial-style home with tall windows and mature trees providing shade and privacy. David could see the guest cottage Margaret had mentioned, positioned at the back of the property with its own garden and a view of a small pond. It looked like something from a magazine, exactly the kind of place he used to imagine living in when he was younger and still believed anything was possible. As David sat in his old car looking at the property, he felt the familiar weight of inadequacy. How could someone like him, with his minimal education and blue-collar background, possibly fit into this world? What if Margaret's other wealthy friends looked down on him? What if Emma felt out of place in such an upscale environment? But then, he thought about Emma's excitement when she talked about the possibility of having her own room and a yard to play in. He thought about the excellent school district and the opportunities it could provide for her future. Most importantly, he thought about the security that Margaret's offer represented. No more choosing between groceries and medical bills, no more working 2 jobs and barely seeing his daughter. On Sunday evening, David made his decision. He called Margaret's number with trembling fingers. Mrs. Whitfield, this is David Martinez. I've thought about your offer and I would like to accept it if it's still available. Margaret's relief was evident in her voice. David, I'm so pleased. When Would you like to start? I can have the cottage prepared for you and Emma whenever you're ready. I need to give notice at my jobs and arrange for our things to be moved. Would 2 weeks be acceptable? That's perfect. David, I think this is going to be wonderful for all of us. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity. David gave notice at both of his jobs, with his supervisors expressing surprise but also happiness for his good fortune. He packed their few possessions and arranged for Emma's school records to be transferred. Emma was thrilled about the move, especially when Margaret took them shopping for new furniture and clothes for Emma's new bedroom. Margaret handled every detail of their transition with efficiency and kindness. She arranged for utilities to be connected at the cottage, stocked the kitchen with groceries, and even registered Emma at the local elementary school. When David protested that she was doing too much, Margaret simply said that she wanted them to feel welcome and settled. On moving day, Margaret was waiting for them at the cottage with fresh flowers and a home-cooked meal. Emma ran through the house excitedly, claiming her new bedroom and exploring the garden. David stood in the living room overwhelmed by the reality of their new situation. It's beautiful, Mrs. Whitfield, I don't know what to say. Say that you're ready to start fresh, Margaret replied. And please call me Margaret. We're going to be working together after all. Margaret had prepared a detailed description of David's responsibilities. He would manage her calendar, coordinate maintenance for both properties, handle correspondence with her lawyers and accountants, and oversee various charitable projects she was involved with. The work was challenging, but interesting, and David found himself enjoying the intellectual stimulation after years of physical labor. Emma thrived in. 2 years later, David stood in the conference room of the Martinez Family Foundation, named in honor of the first family the foundation had helped, his own. The walls were lined with thank you letters from families they had assisted, photographs from foundation events and awards, recognizing their innovative approach to charitable giving. Emma, now 9 years old, sat at the conference table working on her homework while David finished reviewing grant applications for the month. The foundation had grown beyond Margaret's initial vision. What started as a program to help families with medical emergencies had expanded to include educational scholarships, job training programs, and emergency housing assistance. David had proven to be a natural leader and innovative thinker, developing partnerships with hospitals, schools, and social service agencies throughout the region. Margaret, now in her mid-70s, had gradually transitioned from active leadership to an advisory role, spending her time traveling to visit her children and grandchildren while David managed the day-to-day operations. But she still lived in the main house, and the three of them, David, Emma, and Margaret, had become an unconventional but loving family. Daddy, Emma said, looking up from her math homework. Mrs. Patterson from school asked if you could come talk to her class about the foundation. She said the kids have been asking questions about how people help each other. David smiled at his daughter. Emma had grown into a confident, compassionate child who understood that their good fortune came with responsibilities. She often accompanied David to foundation events, helping to serve meals at their community dinners or reading to younger children during their educational programs. That sounds like a great idea, sweetheart. What would you want me to tell them? Emma thought for a moment. Maybe about how sometimes people need help, and sometimes people can give help, and how that's not scary or sad. It's just how people take care of each other. David was amazed, as he often was, by Emma's wisdom. She had articulated the foundation's core philosophy better than many of the grant proposals he reviewed. The office door opened, and Margaret walked in, carrying a manila envelope and wearing the smile she reserved for particularly good news. David, I have something to show you. She handed him the envelope. This arrived this morning. David opened the envelope and found a letter from the National Philanthropic Association, along with what appeared to be an official certificate. As he read the letter, his eyes widened with surprise. Margaret, this says the foundation has been selected to receive the National Excellence in Charitable Innovation Award. Keep reading, Margaret said, barely containing her excitement. David continued reading aloud. The Martinez Family Foundation is being recognized for its groundbreaking approach to charitable giving, which emphasizes dignity, sustainability, and community engagement. The Foundation's work has served as a model for similar organizations nationwide. Emma looked up from her homework. What does that mean? David sat down beside her. It means that the work we're doing here is helping other people start similar programs in their own cities. Families all over the country are going to get help because of what we learned about the best ways to help people. That's really good, Emma said matter-of-factly, then returned to her math problems. Margaret laughed. I love how Emma just accepts that doing good in the world is normal. That's exactly the attitude I hoped she would develop. Later that evening, after Emma had gone to bed, David and Margaret sat on the porch, as they had countless times over the past 2 years. The garden was in full bloom, and the evening air was filled with the scent of Margaret's roses. Do you ever think about how different things might have been? Margaret asked. David knew she was referring to that night in the hospital emergency room. I think about it often, not with regret, but with gratitude. If Emma hadn't gotten sick, if I hadn't been at my lowest point that night, we never would have met you. Margaret nodded. I think about it too. If Richard hadn't died, if I hadn't been spending so much time at the hospital, if I hadn't seen you sitting there with Emma. She trailed off, then continued. I think we were meant to find each other, David. Not just for your sake or Emma's, but for mine too. David looked at her curiously. What do you mean? I mean that helping your family showed me what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. Before I met you, I was just a lonely widow with too much money and no sense of purpose. You gave me the opportunity to make a real difference, to build something meaningful. Margaret paused, then continued with emotion in her voice. Richard and I always talked about using our wealth to help others, but we were always too busy building the business or raising our children. After he died, I felt guilty that we had never followed through on those intentions. The Foundation has allowed me to honor his memory and our shared values in a way that feels authentic and important. David reached over and took Margaret's hand. You saved our lives, Margaret. Emma and I both know that. No, David. We saved each other. You've given me purpose and meaning for my remaining years. Emma has given me the joy of being a grandmother figure, and I've been able to provide you with opportunities to use your talents and character in ways that benefit many families. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, each reflecting on the journey that had brought them together and the work that lay ahead. Margaret, David said finally, there's something I've been thinking about. The Foundation is stable now, successful. Emma is thriving. You've given us more than we ever dreamed possible. But I want you to know that our gratitude isn't just about the money or the opportunities. Margaret listened intently. What I'm most grateful for is that you saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. You believed I could be more than just a struggling single father. You gave me the chance to become someone who could make a difference in other people's lives. That's a gift I can never repay, but I can honor it by continuing to help other families, the way you helped us. Margaret smiled through tears. David, that was never a gift from me to you. That was always who you were. I just provided you with the circumstances where those qualities could flourish. As they sat together in the evening air, David reflected on the incredible transformation his life had undergone. The terrified, desperate man who had wept alone in the emergency room had become a confident leader, capable of helping hundreds of families navigate their own crises. Emma had grown from a sick child into a bright, compassionate young girl with unlimited opportunities ahead of her. But perhaps most remarkably, Margaret had transformed from a lonely, grieving widow into a vital, purposeful woman whose legacy would extend far beyond her lifetime through the Foundation's work. None of them could have predicted how that chance encounter in a hospital waiting room would change all their lives. But they had learned that sometimes the most profound transformations begin with simple acts of human kindness, and that the most meaningful relationships can develop between people who seem to have nothing in common except their capacity for love and their willingness to help each other. The Martinez Family Foundation would continue to grow and help thousands of families in the years to come. But for David, Margaret, and Emma, The foundation's most important success would always be the family they had created together. Three people who had found each other when they needed it most, and built something beautiful from their shared commitment to making the world a little better for everyone.